choices shape the market, our society, and our quality of life. That's why Euroconsumers helps millions of people in their daily choices, providing simple solutions to complex problems. Euroconsumers is a cluster of organizations, a network of people, a group established to protect consumer rights and well-being that brings consumers and companies together in transparent relationships of trust that respect their independence. Our deep understanding of products and consumption gives consumers a credible expert voice worldwide. We bridge the gap between buyers and manufacturers, between supply and demand. And in this digital age, we create opportunities for all parties to come together in constructive dialogue, partnering to build a future of better products and services. Euroconsumers has the power of a global group that believes humanity can develop, grow, and change for the better, and that we can promote this by uniting millions of consumers in strength and speaking responsibly for them, while simultaneously engaging in relationships of trust with responsible, sustainable companies.
Good afternoon and welcome to Euroconsumers Start Talking Webinar for October. Start Talking is the place where each month we bring together practitioners and thought leaders around a hot consumer topic. We've covered crypto, the metaverse, disinformation, to name just a few, and all of these previous episodes are available on Spotify and YouTube, and you can find the links on Euroconsumers website. But this month, we're going to start talking about a social media phenomenon that we're all well aware of, influencers. And more specifically, we'll be talking about the influence economy, what it means for consumers, for brands, for platforms, and for the creators and influencers themselves. So the influence economy is the latest market shift. Marketing budgets are being directed towards creators or people with large followings on social media, looking for those with authentic connections and presence online. And an influencer are able to really make the most of their reach and their connections to actually make some money out of this. So it's becoming a legitimate way to earn a living, if not as your full-time job, but certainly as something which is providing income to lots of different people. But we're going to discover a bit more about how it actually operates and think a little bit about the history of making monetization online. And we're going to look at what some of the pitfalls might be for consumers and how we can create a secure and safe environment for people online. Throughout today's webinar, the Q&A section will be open, so please do add in any questions that you have for any of our fantastic panelists, and we'll try and get to as many of those as we can over the hour. So talking of those panelists, we have four fantastic women with us here today, and I'm going to introduce them very quickly now. First of all, we have Eglyn Brown, and she's worked as a legal officer at DG Just at the European Commission since 2016. She works on consumer protection policy and legislation, including the implementation of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive, with a special focus on digital markets and influencer marketing. So welcome, Eglyn. Next, we have Marina, who is from the Italian Antitrust Authority. Marina is part of the Consumer Protection Directorate, which has carried out several proceedings relating to misleading advertising and unfair commercial practices online. So welcome, Marina. Next, we have Becky Flint, who's director and co-founder of Pepper Studio. This is a boutique influencer marketing agency. And Becky is herself a veteran influencer. She's been creating content online since she was 12. And so she can bring all of that first-hand experience of how the process works for brands, for consumers, for creators, and for platforms. And in her influencer marketing agency, she's then advising on how to best apply that out in the field. She's also participated in some UK policy and parliamentary initiatives around influencer marketing, helping to make it more safe, more transparent and creative, and something that works for everybody. So welcome, Becky. And finally, we have Professor Catalina Goanta, who is an Associate Professor of Law and Technology at the University of Utrecht. She's led countless interesting research projects into the digital world and how it's impacting on us. She's one of those great people who has a brilliant policy and technological view and is able to see things from all sorts of interesting angles. One research project, which I think is particularly relevant for this topic, is on the impact of content monetization on social media and how we might reinterpret private law and fairness in the context of platforms that we experience today. So welcome, Catalina. Okay, so we're all ready to kick off. We're going to invite Catalina to make some opening remarks to set the scene about the monetization of the internet and how the lines have really become blurred between our social experience online and what might be now seen as our commercial experience online. So over to you, Catalina.
Thank you so much, Liz, for your very kind introduction. It's really a pleasure to be here digitally today. And also, it's such a wonderful experience to be on a womanal with such distinguished presenters and also panelists. So let me kick this off by just sharing a couple of thoughts that can perhaps help us understand where exactly we're at right now in the social media world, also according to my own research. So if we can just have the slides on the screen. I'm not going to take too much of your attention with slides, but I just want to make two very important points. So first and foremost, when we think about social media, we traditionally associate social media as an environment that is very much important for freedom of expression, and that's a public square. It's a place where you go for democracy. It's a place where you go and you engage with your peers. And that comes from the more historical dimension of social media as a social network, where indeed you would just engage with your friends on Facebook or on Instagram. You would see their content, and platforms would have a recommender system architecture that would put you in contact with all of these individuals and their peer content. However, what we see increasingly is happening on social media is that it is becoming a place where individuals, users, consume content. So it is a platform for content delivery. It has been replacing television programs. It has been replacing a lot of other more traditional medias, newspapers, or even I should say that it has been displacing these industries because people go to social media to consume content for entertainment, for education, you name it, there's going to be a use for that. And last but not least, there's also another function that social media performs today, and that is the function of commerce. We see that YouTube has locked in a deal with Shopify, one of the biggest dropshipping platforms in the world, to be able to offer e-commerce on YouTube, basically. So among content delivery and the networking dimension. We see that also Instagram has been doing that for a while. Since 2018, it has a checkout button that is available in North America. Even on Twitter, you have Twitter shops since this summer, and the list goes on. So what I would like to really highlight, and because we are at an event by Euroconsumers, perhaps it is not going to be controversial to really say the new social media is really a shop. It's a place where individuals go and they really exercise a lot of their consumer functions because platforms have affordances that allow them to do so. And if we move to the next slide, we can really zoom into the very specific content creator economy. So we're talking about influencers. I'm going to use the words influencer and content creator interchangeably, although it is important to note the fact that influencer, the term influencer, sometimes might lead to negative connotations because of the intrinsic link to marketing and advertising, which is still causing some harms, which I believe some of my co-panelists will talk about later on. But it is important to note that influencer marketing as a business model is currently only one of the types of monetization affordances that platforms offer. You can also make money by just making content and getting ad revenue, for instance, through AdSense. So not through brand deals and sponsoring agreements that go directly to the creator or the influencer, but this mediated ad revenue that platforms like YouTube offer. And then, of course, you can still make money in many other ways, such as getting tokens through live streaming, having subscriptions on platforms, and even selling goods directly to consumers. So it is very important that we keep in mind that monetization is really booming on these social media platforms. And this is the context in which I believe we need to position our discussions about consumers and influencers. Liz, back to you.
Thanks very much, Catalina, for that introduction. I'm going to ask Becky now to come in, because Catalina said the internet's now a shop. I don't know whether you agree with that, or is it a shop, or is it a creative space? Is it both? Could you tell us a bit about, from your experience as an influencer, how the concepts changed since the early days of creators?
I think that it's fascinating because the influencer world and social media is so new that we've only had the past, perhaps, decade, maybe decade and a half to really see how it's changed. But it has changed so much since the beginning. I remember back in 2006, 2007, when I was just starting to create my own content for the first time, the intentions were very different back then because there was no monetization. Brands weren't really paying attention to influencers, as they're called now. Back then, there was no real word for it. And equally, there was no YouTube partner monetization. You would simply upload a video online and share it with an audience who might or might not appear. And that was kind of the beginning and the end of it. Following this, now obviously we can see that there's influencers with multi-million pound houses, massive empires built from the back of their social media success. And now if you begin, if you start a career as an influencer now, you can very clearly see there are these financial gains to be had at the end of the rainbow, so to speak. But I think that we forget sometimes that there's influencer and there's creator, and as was said just previously, it's a difficult line to balance. But ultimately, how can we influence if we're not first creating the content behind it? How can a brand take a commercial significant interest in you and find benefit from it if you do not have this content originally, where you've built an audience and managed to kind of maintain that relationship with your audience, and following that, obviously, then being able to have that influence over them, share products with them that you like, and so on.
That's great. Thanks, Becky. So you think firmly that creation and creativity is still at the heart of it. I'm going to ask Egelin now. You've worked for DG Just at the Commission. Influencer marketing has been on your radar for a few years, so we know it's relatively new, but you've been thinking about it for a while. What do you see as the harms consumers might face, and what rules do you have in place to try to protect them? If you could just give us a brief rundown of that, that'd be fantastic.
Yes, thank you so much. So indeed, influencer marketing and, let's say, the evolving world of social commerce is certainly on our radar. The harms that the consumers may have are certainly multifaceted. I would say the main issue that has been the focus with influencer marketing is, of course, the transparency of advertising and sponsored content more broadly. So to begin with, there's a very clear obligation in EU consumer law to make sure that all commercial communications are clearly disclosed to consumers as such. And what we recently clarified in the Commission's own guidelines on the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive is that this obligation of transparency covers various practices that the influencer may engage in, including, of course, paid posts, but also affiliate content, retweets, tagging the brand, some kind of joint live streams, you name it. And we also clarified that this obligation of transparency applies whenever the influencer is receiving any form of consideration for the endorsement. So including in case of direct payments, but also in case of discounts or partnership arrangements, percentages from affiliate links that the consumer may click, free products, including sometimes unsolicited gifts, free trips, free event invitations. So in a nutshell, you don't really need a contract or monetary payment from the trader in order to trigger the application of these laws that we already have. And also this disclosure, of course, has to be sufficiently clear for consumers to understand, taking into account all the circumstances. For instance, it might not be clear to use hashtag ad that is hidden somewhere in a lengthy disclaimer, or to only tag a trader with nothing else, or if it requires a consumer to take any kind of other action to find out about the sponsored nature of the content, like clicking on read more or something like that. And all of these rules, they apply just the same if we're talking about brand products, or the influencer is promoting their own products or their own company. So indeed, transparency is key. I would also highlight a second type of harm that we see more relating to the content itself that influencers are producing, or content creators more broadly. So attention should be paid whenever influencers are endorsing products or services that are a bit sensitive by nature. So like promoting health supplements, weight loss products, things that claim to prevent a COVID infection, gambling, games or services that resemble gambling. Things like that. For example, we just saw, I believe a week ago, Kim Kardashian being fined $1.26 million for not being sufficiently transparent about being paid to endorse crypto assets. So long story short, there are specific rules on what you can and cannot do in advertising, but as a general word of advice, whenever the nature of the content or the product is more sensitive, or the more vulnerable your target audience is, like children, the more responsibility will ultimately be expected by not only authorities but also by the consumers.
Thanks, Eglin, for covering. It's a really big topic that you're working on, but that's a nice, clear, concise coverage. And Marina Catalozzi, can you tell us a bit more about the case that your agency brought and why it was a priority for action?
Yes, of course. First of all, our main goal of the authority is to protect consumers, and especially in this field, in the web, where for consumers sometimes it's difficult to distinguish if is the content is an advertising or it's an editorial content. So also as an authority, we need to keep up with the new trends and the new way marketing develops. And the principle that we put in place is that also influencer must comply with consumer laws, especially the authority enforces the unfair commercial directive, which has been transposed in the Italian Consumer Code. And the main issue is that influencers need to disclose the commercial purpose, or must disclose using the labeling ad, ADV, or gifted by, sponsored by. This is very important because we need to increase consumers and content creator and influencer, but also company awareness on this point. At the beginning, in 2017, the first action concerned influencers and brand owners, and it was a soft action in the sense that it was a so-called moral suasion. Influencer and brand owners were invited to change the way that they posted some contents in order to let consumer identify the advertising. And there was collaboration as the brand owner and the influencer changed the way they were posting contents. But at the beginning, we involved a little number of influencers. Then in 2019, we started our formal proceedings, for example, against Alitalia and a group of influencers. Alitalia is the national carrier. Mm-hmm. And there were some, we focused on some posts where influencer were shown with a jumper or t-shirt that had the logo of Alitalia, which was produced by an Italian stylist, Alberta Perretti. But from the consent, it was not clear that there was a sponsorship or anyway an endorsement of the product. In 2020, we had we started another proceeding against Barilla, which is an well-known food company, because some influencer posted the content with cookies without disclosing the commercial nature of the post. And so also in this case, we highlighted the principle that influencers are subject to the consumer law, to the consumer code. And at last, we had another proceeding against BET, the British Tobacco Authority, because some influencer, this is a particular proceeding, because the influencer who posted advertising using the label invited, was a so-called call to action, invited other people to publish other contents with the e-cigarettes, and the problem was that the recruited person did not use the labeling. And so they were publishing an advertising without telling consumer that these were advertising. So again, we repeated the general principle to protect consumers. In these cases, we accept commitment from influencers, from the brand owners. They were a good set of commitments, so the authority considered them adequate to remove the problems and the issues why we started the proceedings. And so it's a constant issue, because
it's constant.
Since 2017 we paid attention to the word influencer marketing.
Yeah, I think that's a good point. I mean, we're saying, oh, it's new, but actually it's been happening for a long time, and obviously policy and enforcement has been there acting on this for some years, with the very simple principle that any kind of commercial relationship, whether there's a contract or not, it's the nature of the activity which would see you falling foul of consumer protection law. I've got a question that's come in from Dr. Rachel Kent, who says that she's done lots of research on the detrimental impact of influencers sharing misinformation on health or fitness. This can be really problematic with some tangible harms of mental and physical health. And asking what can be done to tackle this. I want to put this one over to Catalina, because platforms have been given the responsibility to moderate content. There's the Digital Services Act, which has the disinformation code of conduct, etc. And this seems to be like joining up of the influencer marketing plus misinformation. And how does that stopping platforms from working effectively to moderate things?
So that's a very, very important question. So thank you very much, Dr. Rachel Kent, for this question. I think that with disinformation, we really need to think about content moderation on many different levels and layers. So disinformation is really just basically intelligence operations, which are targeting a very specific goal. But then we also have misinformation. And then here, it's very important to reflect upon, do we have influencers who really have a specific opinion about a policy which they may or may not agree with? For instance, in the Netherlands, to give you an example, during the COVID lockdowns, there were influencers who were contracted by the government to promote a lot of social distancing policies, and then who turned around because of the fact that they had additional incentives. It was not very clear in the media whether, again, these incentives were equally monetary, but turned around this type of message and said, no, we're against social distancing. And then you have a very interesting question of, well, is that freedom of expression? Is there a protection for freedom of expression? And or do we label something as misinformation? And platforms really, I think, I have to say that platforms did quite a good job trying to label and also monitor and moderate a lot of these forms of misleading information. But back to what something that Egelin was mentioning earlier, to the extent that a content creator is going to make content where you involve products that are going to be harmful for consumers. So, for instance, all sorts of quackeries around COVID treatments and masks that don't work, then those are also to a certain extent illegal products, or there will be a matter of illegality. And then there's really quite a big responsibility for platforms to try to monitor these types of transactions and then try to take measures against the accounts that engage in these kind of practices.
I think that, thanks. I think that's really helpful and a great example there from the Netherlands. I suppose what struck me with the listening to Egelin and Marina is this very strong principle that anything commercial could be in breach of consumer protection law if it's not disclosed. But I wanted to bring in Becky here because I think when we were talking the other day, you were saying that sometimes influencers themselves can feel slightly vulnerable, so they can almost be like targeted and online. And I wonder whether we do have individuals, people here. They're not big brands with huge, policy and PR behind them. They're individuals who are being left with a lot of responsibility. So is that the right balance? Are we getting it right?
It's quite a tricky one, isn't it? Because where does the line get drawn between a regular user of the internet and an influencer, especially with platforms being so popular these days, like TikTok, where actually it's significantly more easy to reach large audiences without any, pre-existing audience behind you. As long as your message is able to resonate and the algorithm picks it up, then your voice can be heard to millions of people. And with that, where does that innate knowledge and understanding of the rules, the regulations, what we should and shouldn't be sharing online, what has the capacity to cause harm? I mean, misinformation can be shared by anybody online, but it does become a more significant problem when it's being shared by those with a large following. And with that, what's our perception of a person with a large following? Does that give them more authority and therefore we trust them more? What they're saying must be more factual, when in fact, do they have other barometers that we would normally use in life before the internet, like a degree or certifications, qualifications? All of that seems like it's going out of the window, and the following is kind of up there as well with it. But I think that something really key to consider when talking about this is how the platforms can get involved to support the creators and the influencers, and also to just help weigh in with this issue. I mean, in terms of flagging content, we've seen dark practices happening in terms of how algorithms really start to create echo chambers around certain ideas, around misinformation. And if we can intervene in that and create a more balanced space, and also just having, flagging tools like, actually, this hasn't been backed up, let's challenge this viewpoint. I think that would be a really great step to see rolled out a little bit more widely.
Yeah, thanks. They're great points. I feel like there is more that platforms can do. Unfortunately, we couldn't secure a platform to speak with us today, but I want to put something to Egelin, which she may which is something that they may ask her if they were here. I mean, are platforms being asked to do too much? We've got the Digital Services Act that's already imposed loads more obligations on platforms. We've talked about monitoring for product safety, for disinformation, for misinformation, for misleading advertising. I mean, they've created these successful experiences that are very, very popular with the amount of people using platforms. Won't all the rules, these new rules, just completely stifle that? What would you say to that, Egelin?
Well, that's indeed one perspective, to be a bit hesitant about indeed the piling up of new obligations, which indeed, when it comes to online platforms, has certainly expanded, I would say, in the course of the last year with new initiatives such as the Digital Services Act, the Digital Markets Act, but also other pieces of legislation which may indirectly affect, some of the recommender systems, for instance, the AI Act, and so on and so forth. But I would say already now, today, um, under these general EU consumer law rules, platforms already have a certain professional diligence that is expected from them towards consumers. And this applies also, of course, to the brands that are using influencers for promotions, as well as this applies to the influencers themselves who are ultimately posting something online. So all of the actors in this chain have their share of responsibility. And in terms of who exactly will be held liable, for a given breach will depend very much on the circumstances. So, what is it about? Is it about the lack of transparency, about sponsored content, or is it about indeed gifting tokens through social media platforms, or direct selling, or what have you? But I would say, indeed, already now there are certain obligations for platforms. So, in that sense, instruments like the DSA, the Digital Services Act, will undoubtedly be a landmark instrument that will further clarify the obligations that platforms have. And it will, I would say, significantly improve the way online content moderation happens more broadly, not only as regards disinformation, misinformation, but also just hidden advertising, things like that. Having said that, the DSA as such does not explicitly address influencer marketing in a sense that you will not find there a specific article going into detail about obligations in the case of influencer marketing. However, there are many new general obligations on advertising transparency. Now, some of these new obligations that platforms will have will apply more to the kinds of ads that platforms are themselves selling, or the types of promotion services that they are offering. So, not necessarily to user generated content that may take the form of advertising. So this is due to the way some of the provisions will be phrased, but also the definition of advertisement that is included in that act. Whereas there are some other provisions that will, I think, directly help. For instance, in the future, platforms will be obliged, black on white, to make sure that there is functionality to declare that there is sponsored content, or that you are essentially posting a commercial communication. Moreover, whenever influencers themselves are making use of the platform's endorsement possibilities, like buying promotions for their post, then they would be subject as well to all of these new advertising rules. And more generally, the DSA, of course, will help with the reporting of hidden advertising and other problematic practices, things that qualify as illegal content. There's also an obligation to introduce new measures to protect minors in particular. There's encouragement of standardization, including on advertising labels, so to make it more clear and effective, and let's say more uniform in terms of what kinds of hashtags or labels are being used out there. So to conclude, I don't think platforms are being asked to do too much, particularly when it comes to influencer marketing. If anything, all of these new rules that are in the process of being adopted and finalized mainly clarify obligations that have already existed previously. So I think it's rather a good thing now that platforms will have more legal certainty about what exactly is expected from them. And likewise for the influencers and for all the users on these platforms.
Okay, thank you for that. That's really helpful. I'm going to go to another question that's come in, which is quite a practical one related to this and responsibilities. I think it's really about getting some of the principles you've talked about into practice. So they're asking, in terms of how and where to reveal the commercial relationship between the influencer and the brand, how prominent does the hashtag ad need to be? I think that's a question in itself. A bigger question is really, where can people go if you're an influencer online? Where can you actually go and get all of this clarified so that you can be sure you're adhering to the law?
Yes, good question. So the document that I mentioned, of course, is the European Commission's own guidelines that we published, which are about the interpretation and application of the Unfair Commercial Practices Directive. So there is a chapter there on influencer marketing where you can familiarize yourself with some of these key principles that I mentioned. Having said that, it is, of course, a rather legalistic type of document that maybe is not ready for consumption for everyone outside of the policy bubble. So there are also, let's say, more practical types of guidelines that are being developed by national enforcement authorities in the national language of a given member state. Then there's also a very lively world of self-regulation in the advertising world. And there as well, they have published specific guidelines to better steer not only the influencers, but also the brands who will make use of this marketing.
Yeah. Okay. So look for your national enforcement agencies and the vibrant self-regulation world out there, and there should be some clarity for you as these things come in. I wanted to come back to Marina now, who also was going to add something about the brand owners and the platform's commitments and what they should be doing in this space, as well as what the actual influencers should be doing.
Of course, influencers involved in the proceedings before antitrust authority changed the way they made the post, but also brand owners adopted guidelines to remind the importance of transparency, and adopted measure also to check that their influencer correctly used the labeling, and also they changed some contractual terms both with influencer and the agencies who recruit influencers, in order to put the obligation to use the labeling. And also they put in place the measure to check that this obligation was respected by influencers. And so this was a good point. We had also in 2022, we closed a proceeding against TikTok, because it was suspected to let the platform be used also for hidden advertising. And so the platform to change it and made clearer the policy, the ad policy, the content user policy, and also adopted a tool to help a content creator to reveal the commercial purpose. And moreover, he adopted also some measure in case there was a complaint regarding a specific content. There is a moderator team that will investigate, and at first he would invite the influencer to add the labeling. If the influencer does not comply with this invite, TikTok may suspend the account or terminate the contract with the content.
Oh, thank you. That's really interesting. I think that there's something we'll come to a bit later when we talk about the scale of the enforcement that's needed with this many people online. Catalina, you had a point about brand admissions. Would you like to come in on this as well?
Yeah, just to build on also what Egelin was mentioning. So I think that we have here, this entire industry is a two-sided blade, because on the one hand it's new, but on the other hand it's not new. So word of mouth marketing, the idea that you have hidden marketing, deceiving practices, these have been around for ages. You know, the Federal Trade Commission was dealing with deceiving marketing in the beginning of the 20th century. So we just have new expressions of these practices. And an example of how, so Egelin was mentioning, and I completely agree with everything that she mentioned. She was mentioning the applicability of the DSA or the lack thereof to influencer marketing, the Digital Services Act, because it is supposed to cover advertising that is paid to the platform. Well, lo and behold, TikTok has that now. So it is some form of on-platform influencer marketing that Twitch has been also doing since 2018, where basically, and I think also YouTube has been doing that or had been doing that for a while, where you have the platform as an intermediary, as a marketplace, bringing together the influencer, the creator, and then also the brand. The only problem is that they're trying to take very large cuts, and I don't think that that's very useful for creators. But the brand admissions are an example of where basically brands do pay platforms, and then this type of influencer marketing will definitely, in my interpretation, fall under the Digital Services Act. But we need to keep on being aware of practices and interpreting them in the light of the platform affordances, the functionalities that they make available.
Sure. So we're getting, blurring boundaries just gives more and more opportunities for innovative new ways of delivering stuff, which then further you need to look back at the policy and see if that's covered. But I like your point that a lot of these challenges were existing in the offline world, but are appearing in a different form online. I think I wanted to come to Becky, as I think someone having grown up with this, and I would say, is it fair to say, aware of the sort of internet cultures and influencer culture? I mean, aren't younger people who are using or who are perhaps responding to creators and influencers, they've grown up online. This world is their world. Should they not be a bit savvier about if someone's selling them something? I mean, we're told that they're immersed in it. Should they not know that this commercial thing's going on?
Well, I remember when I was happy 12, 13-year-old, I was watching, there's this makeup influencer on YouTube called Michelle Phan, and she was making all these amazing makeup recreations online, and she would always talk about this Coastal Scents palette, which was an eyeshadow palette, had every color under the sun. I wanted it so badly. I was like, oh my god, if I had a PayPal account or a credit card at that time, I would definitely have bought it. She even had a discount code for her followers. I thought, wow, like that's so generous of her. Like that's amazing. That's so nice that she has a discount code. Years down the line, I actually was reached out to partner with this very same brand, and I was being offered a kickback on the discount code. I was getting paid to do the video, and I was just quite. I put two and two together, and I was like, hang on a minute, this partnership, which the makeup influencer had originally, actually, that was a commercial partnership, which I just didn't see at the time because I was a child. You don't really have that sense when your favorite celebrity or influencer is promoting things or creating content at that time. It just doesn't really necessarily click. And I don't think that it's the young people's responsibility necessarily to know that they're being advertised to. I think that the advertising needs to be far more explicit. Even to compare it to television, for example, in the UK, there's a spinning wheel in the corner to show that, the advertisements are coming, or there's a P to say this contains promotional material. Most people don't necessarily realize that that's actually there and what that signifies, unless you're kind of a little bit more in the industry. So I think that advertising disclosure could be a lot more overt, and social media and digital marketing is no exception to that.
Thank you. And it brings us really nicely onto a question that's come in from our audience, from Stephen Berger, who's saying exactly that. Just advising that you need to be transparent is necessary, but is that sufficient? Should we be mandating by law how ads should be displayed? And his point he's making is that if you have a 20-minute YouTube video, is it okay just to have a little indication at the beginning, or should these labels be a lot more clearer? I'm wondering, would anyone in our panel like to take that? Should we be mandating how we communicate that things are commercial? I've got a Catalina. Catalina, could you take that one, please?
Yeah, and maybe Egelin can also build on that, because she has referred to that also earlier. So the idea is that we have a lot of self-regulation. Egelin mentioned that already. There are a lot of these codes of practice that are going to say, for instance, like the Advertising Standards Association in the UK, that Becky might be very familiar with. the Stichting Reclamecode in the Netherlands. There are so many industry hubs that do produce very easy to read documents that will say, you need to include these hashtags. These hashtags, make sure you don't include. The main problem is that very often, a lot of these organizations will have different approaches. So what we end up seeing is, for instance, in Germany, where there was a lot of case law, where judges looked at hashtags, at where the hashtags were supposed to be placed. There are certain discussions about the hashtags, but not so many discussions about the platform feature of disclosing advertising. At the same time, Instagram, for instance, developed this feature that says paid partnership. Whereas, as Egelin already mentioned, even if you have a barter, that's still influencer marketing, it's still advertising, to the extent that you have the quid pro quo, you're receiving a good or a service in exchange for advertising. So platforms kind of, locked in the idea. So they did a little bit of harm there as well. They locked in the idea that, okay, you can use this if you're paid.
Right.
And then on the one hand, perhaps some creators would say, we don't want to use this because maybe it's going to scare our audiences away. Maybe we don't get enough engagement on these kind of labeled posts. But then at the same time, it's also a very insufficient post. So maybe I can agree perhaps with our commentator, with Stephen, that perhaps that should be made more clear, more inclusive, that yes, you need to disclose a much wider array of commercial activities.
Thanks, Catalina. And quickly, Becky, and then I'm going to come to Egelin as well on this point.
Yeah, of course. I would just like to add that I feel like hashtag ad is very much a reactive practice that actually the influencers themselves had to come up with, because there was no infrastructure out there on how to disclose that you had a commercial partnership, and much less was that wide awareness that these commercial partnerships need to be disclosed until, influencers go ahead, they get in trouble, and the regulations suddenly have a lot more visibility amongst the creator community. But we need a lot more of these proactive practices to be put into place. And even so, we have paid partnership buttons, yes, but what happens when there's a commercial relationship between an influencer and a brand that isn't a paid partnership? They're being given a free product, or they've been sent somewhere to stay overnight for free. They're not receiving cash, but they are receiving an experience. And I think that nuance does matter, because I think it will also be reflected in how the influencer speaks about the brand, and also how the audience thinks about the influencer that they follow. You can see, yes, they're getting a lot of free experiences, but they're not actually getting that much cash in their pocket. I think the nuance there is important in terms of how the influencer is perceived. But again, we don't have the infrastructure there to be able to disclose in that kind of granular detail just yet.
It also feels like, and I know everyone always says, oh, it's about education and consumer understanding, but I think there is a lot now to understand the difference between the types of commercial relationship and what it all means, and to really understand how the money is flowing through it, because then that can help consumers understand what's really going on. Egelin, do you want to come in on this as well, please?
Yes, thank you so much. No, indeed, first of all, I would agree that actually the consumer should be able to understand the sponsored nature of any given thing that they're seeing without knowing all the different content monetization models and the different types of arrangements or brand ambassadorships that may be on the background. It should be clear literally by looking at it in order to comply with the rules. Now, as to Stephen's question about whether this should be mandated by law, indeed, it's an open question. My personal opinion is that a lot of these things that we're talking about, what kind of hashtags to use, or even the concept of a hashtag, I mean, these are elements that may become outdated quite quickly. We may soon be asking about, okay, how to disclose advertising in the metaverse or in whatever other kind of format. How do you disclose advertising over voice with IoT devices, for instance, and so on and so forth. So in a way, personally, I do appreciate that we have some kind of general principles established by the law, but there's always going to be room for interpretation. And indeed, we have to strike the right balance in what we put in the actual law in order to ensure that it's future-proof. Now, on that note, it gives me a good occasion to just share the word that the Commission has launched a fitness check or an evaluation of the current consumer laws in order to check whether they are still fit for purpose or whether any additional amendments to the laws are necessary, including on the topic of influencer marketing. So this could be one of the topics where we are asking for your input. And indeed, we would like to know if you see that there is a need for mandating certain things in the law, clarifying, for instance, the limits of what types of exchanges or barters, what is actually covered by the advertising rules, and also the obligations of platforms and other websites, just how you have to disclose the sponsored content. There is, of course, this trend of moving more towards mandating in the law all kinds of things about the online interfaces of websites. So we are definitely seeing a lot of that. But the question is open, whether that's the right way ahead also for consumer and marketing laws.
Thanks very much, Eglin. And yes, I can see why there's a bit of trepidation around that, because I think so often the answer is information labeling, which is helpful, but it's never enough. It needs to be done with them, I think, with other things around the system and other forms of protection. So we've got 10 minutes left, and I think we're already touching on a few of the future aspects like the metaverse and brand missions. But I did want to come back to Marina just to reflect on the enforcement actions that the Italian authority carried out. Do you think enforcers have the right tools and capacity to do this work? Or is the scale of not just influencer marketing, but the scale of platform issues just too much for national enforcement bodies to be monitoring?
But of course, we can monitor every influencers. The point is also that we check the ones maybe we receive complaints for, and we set principles also for the whole market. Sometimes it also happens that we ask the influencer if there is some kind of payment, and they took the evidence of the payment of the products they posted, so that there was just the personal experience, but that they didn't receive money because they bought the product. So sometimes it doesn't seem the post doesn't seem an advertising because it wasn't an advertising. So sometimes it's even hard to verify if it's a case of hidden advertising. I also agree that it's difficult to tell where you need to put the label, which character use, which evidence to give. It's a case-by-case evaluation, and so we should look to the single post, to the context. We can say before checking it. So it's a challenge for us because it's a new way, of marketing. It's also interesting to follow the trend. And so we try to to investigate with the limited number of resources we have, but we try to face this goal.
So it's prioritizing the ones which will have an impact. We're coming up towards the end now, and I think, and we've touched on a few things about the future, and we've talked at the beginning really about how much has changed in the last 10 to 15 years. So looking ahead, I'm going to ask everybody really, where do you see the creator economy, influencer marketing, or generally monetization on the internet going next? And are you hopeful it can be safe and sustainable for both the supply and demand side? And and if so, why? So I'd just like to get your thoughts a little bit, looking 10 years into the future, where we might be and what's happening. Who'd like to go first? I'm going to go to Becky first, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course. I feel like we're so truly led by social culture and the digital culture that emerges online. I mean, an app that's been very popular recently is called Be Real, and it's a very hyper-personal app. It's almost the antithesis of how we're taught to use other social media apps, where we're taught to use apps like TikTok, Instagram, YouTube in their excess. With Be Real, we're taught to just visit it once a day, check in, check out. That's all that's required of you. And I think that as generations shift, we all want to be doing the opposite of what the generation previous to us was doing. So if we're in the current generation of overconsumption, perhaps the new generation coming in will trend towards a more minimalist approach to how they interact with social media, and influencers obviously are part of that digital culture as well. We're also seeing a lot more trend towards influencers. Actually, the fact that the influencer doesn't have a job and being an influencer is their job is actually starting to become slightly off-putting to audiences. Instead, we want to see more real people and real experiences being played out in front of us to be inspired by and be influenced by. So we're seeing, apps again like TikTok, bringing a whole new generation of micro influencers to the surface who have a lot more relatable lives. You're also seeing huge trends towards advice-based content, optimization of the self of our culture, a lot of recommendations going around there. So I wonder, in 10 years, are we all going to be over-optimized? We're all sharing our kind of hive mind of resources at the moment. I feel like this is only the beginning, but it's going to continue to accelerate into the future. And then ultimately, I feel like it's going to become platform agnostic. We need to follow, as influencer marketers, where the influence goes. And could this be something where influencers are now creating their own Discord servers? Their followers are going to be interacting with them and building communities away from social platforms entirely, and away from the hub around the content, but it's around the community. So things like newsletters, Discord servers, communities being built from the back of influencers. I'm definitely going to be keeping my eyes on that as well.
That's such an interesting take. Yeah, and my kids have started using Be Real, and it definitely chimes with me that they like the simplicity of it. That is so novel. So we've got the older generation thinking, oh, the connection's novel, and they're kind of like, well, this is really novel and different. So it's fascinating. Catalina, what's your take on where things could go in the future?
So a fascinating example with Be Real. What I'm thinking also, to answer your question, Liz, I'm wondering what monetization will look like on Be Real, because monetization will be coming for Be Real, unless it becomes a public service, and then that can also be a future of the internet, less commercial spaces, back to the creative commons of the internet, the common spaces. But the way I see things, looking at platform functionalities for monetization, this process is only going to accelerate. What I hope we will see in around 10 years is more stability, more consistency, because right now the pace of change and also the different iterations that change brings with it are, I think, sometimes disruptive. And lastly, I would really hope to see more educated consumers, but also more educated influencers. And I think that here we have a common role to play in just making legal information more accessible, making it, simplifying it also from a regulatory perspective. Because I'm a legal scholar, but sometimes I wonder if I had to really map every single rule that an influencer like Becky would have to respect and abide by, it would be just insane. So even myself as an expert in this, I wouldn't understand all of the rules and their interplay, to be more precise. But I think so stability and clarity, transparency, I think would be some features that I would hope to see in the next 10 years.
Thanks, that's excellent. Marina, just super quickly, we're running out of time, but what do you think is coming up in the future?
Yes, me too. I think that the success of influencer marketing will continue because it's easy access, easy contact, it's quick. But I hope that there will be more awareness from both sides, from consumer side and influencer side, of the importance of transparency.
That's great. Thank you. And Eglin, I'm going to leave you with the final word. Where do you see things going in the future? And are you hopeful?
I'm absolutely hopeful, and indeed, it was fascinating to hear about all of these different ideas that you have about the way monetization will evolve. Indeed, I have no clue in which direction or what will prevail, but I would agree certainly with Becky about this need for more authenticity, this moving away from what influencer marketing was 5 years ago to what we see now with Be Real. What's on my radar in particular, I would say maybe not for 10 years, but certainly for the midterm, are indeed the use of all kinds of virtual items, tokens, virtual intermediate currency that's sort of embedded in some of these new monetization models, as well as the subscription models and so on. But in general, I'm hopeful not only because we have this beautiful EU consumer law framework that already establishes principles that would apply to regardless of how things go, but also because we do see more awareness. I think not only with the great new generation that is more aware of things like hidden advertising, but also because the brands and the platforms will now very soon have much more clear obligations, and they are certainly aware about all of these concerns here as well. So I am hopeful.
Thanks, Eglin. That's great. Well, we have to close now, but thank you everyone to Eglin, Catalina, Becky and Marina. It's been a really fantastic discussion. I don't know if we've solved everything, but you've certainly given everyone loads to think about. So thanks very much. And thanks for everyone who's watching. And if you found it interesting, please join us for more Start Talking. We hold them once a month on issues like this. And you can also share the link with your friends or revisit and rewatch this on Spotify or YouTube. So thanks very much, everyone. Good afternoon.